Thanks. Well, I'm a professor of oceanography at University of Hawaii. And I'm going to talk about mining the deep sea floor, treasure versus destruction in the ocean's most pristine ecosystems. And one of the things I need to do as a scientist is acknowledge the source of funding that has supported our research. And so I'm not going to read through them, but most of the work I'm going to talk about right now has been funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trust. And just to show you what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to have to wear my reading glasses, I guess. I'll start out by talking about deep sea mineral types and their distribution, what miners are after in the bottom of the ocean. Talk a little bit about exploration claims in international waters and areas beyond national jurisdiction. The nature of mining activities, what they'll entail. Characteristics of the Clipperton Clearing Zone nodule ecosystems, the largest area that's likely to be mined in the deep sea. Some of the expected nodule mining impacts. Talk about current environmental conservation measures, and then go to some conclusions.
Excuse me. Again, what is actually CCZ?
CCZ is Clipperton Clearing Zone. Clipperton Clearing Zone. You'll see. I'll show you. One thing I would prefer if you could hold the questions till the end. Otherwise, I'll never get through the material. Okay. Thanks. But good question. Okay. Well, there are three major types of minerals that are of interest for mining at the deep sea floor. The first are associated with seafloor massive sulfides, and these are areas, they're giant mounds of sulfide and metal-rich sediment that were formed by hydrothermal vents on the seafloor at depths of 1,000 to 4,000 meters in the ocean, and they're potential sources of copper, gold, silver, and zinc. The next major resource type, or mineral type, is polymetallic nodules. A lot of people call them manganese nodules. And these are the abyssal plains of the seafloor out in the open ocean at depths of 4,000 to 6,000 meters. And they're potential sources of copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and REE, or rare earth elements, things that we use in our cell phones and other kinds of electronics. And then the third major type of mineral is associated with seamounts distributed around the ocean. And these are cobalt-rich crusts that occur at depths of 800 to 2,500 meters. And they're rich in cobalt, nickel, manganese, and also rare earth elements, potentially. Now, where are these minerals distributed? Actually, they're quite widely distributed in the ocean. The polymetallic sulfides, or massive sulfides associated with hydrothermal venting, are these yellow triangles, and they're distributed wherever there are mid-ocean ridges, spreading centers all throughout the middle of the ocean basins, and also in what are called back arc basins on the ocean margins where trenches are causing flexure of the crust, and then more hydrothermal vents can form and you can get massive sulfides. The cobalt-rich crusts on seamounts, those are these red pentagons, and they're also widely distributed in the ocean. But most of the interest is in mining, as we'll see, in the Western Pacific in this region here. And finally, polymetallic nodules, the purple circles, are really very broadly distributed at the abyssal sea floor in the oceans, in all major ocean basins. But again, most of the interest is in the Pacific in this region here, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, so all of these mineral types are quite broadly distributed, and there is a lot of interest now. Mining has not begun, but they're gearing up for it. There's a lot of interest, development of regulations, and mining companies developing technology. And as an example, there is a recent article in the Economist magazine, Nature magazine. I was actually interviewed twice yesterday by different publications about the potential impacts of deep sea mining. So there's a lot of interest, and it's hard to say when it'll actually begin. Probably within the next 5 years are the best estimates, but it could be shorter or longer. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about exploration claims in areas beyond national jurisdiction. All that areas beyond national jurisdiction just means in international waters, beyond the exclusive economic zone of countries. And mining in the deep ocean, at the deep ocean floor in areas beyond national jurisdiction is regulated by the International Seabed Authority. And this is a management body that was set up. It's set up by the UN through the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And in fact, most countries sign the United Nations, the Law of the Sea Treaty, because they hope to benefit from deep sea mining. And there, I'll show you where right now there are a variety of different exploration claims, areas where different countries or major corporations are exploring minerals to see what areas they want to mine. And we'll start with massive sulfides. There are 7 exploration licenses or exploration claims in the ocean, and these are shown here. I think I'm missing one or 2, but basically they are in the North Atlantic and in the Southwest Indian Ocean, and each of these claims is composed of 100 10 by 10 kilometer blocks. So they've marked off 100 blocks, each 10 kilometers on a side along these ridges for exploration. Ultimately, they're only supposed to mine 10 blocks in their claim, but they're exploring 100. Okay, polymetallic nodules, also known as manganese nodules. There's a lot of interest in this, and there are actually 17 exploration claims or contracts distributed across in 2 ocean basins. One is in the Indian Ocean here. India has a claim in the Indian Ocean. And then 16 of them are in this area called the Clipperton-Clarion Zone, because it's bounded by the Clarion Fracture Zone on the north and the Clipperton Fracture Zone on the south. So there are 16 exploration claims in this area. These are these brightly covered areas, brightly colored. And each of them is up to 75,000 square kilometers in area, about the size of the country of Austria. And the whole management area here is about 5 million square kilometers. And if you superimpose it on the continental United States, it stretches from New York to California. So it's a big area. It's about 5,000 kilometers across and 3,000 kilometers north, or 2,500 kilometers north to south. Okay, cobalt-rich crust, there's not as much interest, but there are some exploration claims. There are 3 in the Western Pacific on these seamounts here, south of Japan in international waters. And then there's 1 claim on the Rio Grande Rise in the Atlantic. It's a Brazilian claim southwest or southeast of Brazil. Why is there such interest in mining the deep ocean floor? Well, it turns out, well, let's just talk about manganese nodules in this case, that they're manganese nodules and also, to a lesser degree, the cobalt-rich crust and the massive sulfides are major potential sources of important metals. Particular nodules are important, potentially good sources of copper, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. And the demand for these, or copper, in fact, all of these metals and elements is expected to go up dramatically in the next few decades. Copper, because of infrastructure development as India develops, it's expected that the demand for copper will go up exponentially. And prices are expected to go up here as projected by the World Bank. But also you can see that metals prices are also can be very volatile. So that's one reason it's difficult to predict when prices will be high enough for mining to be profitable. Now, why do we think that these metals are desirable, or these rare earth elements? Well, partly for green technology. It turns out that batteries, wind-powered wind turbines, all kinds of solar energy technology, solar panels, etc., all use a variety of metals and rare earth elements. And this is just an example of projection from the World Bank showing, in order to prevent, or to keep global warming at 2 degrees, 4 degrees, or 6 degrees, how much of one rare earth element, neodymium, which occurs in manganese nodules, would be needed to meet the demands of limiting CO2 emissions to keep the temperature rising no more than 2, 4, or 6 degrees for onshore wind turbines and offshore wind turbines. And right now there's about 7,000 tons of this produced per year to meet even the 6-degree warming. You know, the 6-degree warming, I guess, is down here. It's still, we'd have to increase the production of neodymium by 10-fold, and to really produce enough turbines projected to reduce or keep CO2 emissions, keep it down, or such that the climate only warms 2 degrees. Whoops. Let's go back here. Previous. we'd need to, neodymium production will have to go up by 30 or 40 fold. So there looks like there's potentially a big demand for these rare earth elements. Now, polymetallic nodules in particular are a tremendous trove of these metals. Manganese, if we look at the amount of these minerals, these metals in the nodules global, or this is just in the Clipperton Clarion zone, we see that there are 290 years of current production of manganese, equivalent of 290 years of current production, 135 years of nickel, and 2,000 years of cobalt. So this is a huge amount of metal, but if it's sold on the market for a profit, it could potentially yield vast profits, and that's why a variety of countries and mining consortia are interested in this. It also turns out that these nodules are quite rich in the metals. They're high-grade ore compared to the remaining land-based ores, with nickel up to 1.5%, cobalt 1.4%, or copper rather 1.4%, cobalt 0.25%, and these are all very high mineral grades. So they're potentially very valuable if they can be brought up to the surface in an economical fashion, brought up to the surface of the ocean. Well, what will mining activities look like? Contrary to what some of the mining contractors say, this is mining. It's not just harvesting nodules from the seafloor. And I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on manganese nodules. I'll say a little bit about the other resources, but manganese nodules are the biggest potential source of metals, and they're also currently generating the most interest. But all of the mining activities, including manganese nodule mining or cobalt-rich crust or seamounts, will involve some kind of mining head that goes along the seafloor, and it removes the minerals and the substrate. It brings up the seafloor, the resource, and will destroy the seafloor habitat as it moves. And so for nodules, it'll suck up the sediment in the nodules. It'll pump them up a pipe, a riser pipe, to a surface vessel where the ore, the metallic fragments, polymetallic fragments of nodules will be separated from water. And then there will be a return pipe setting down the remaining water from dewatering the nodules, which will be pumped back down to down into the ocean somewhere, potentially to the seafloor or somewhere in the water column. And this will also be laden with sediments and with heavy metals from the nodules. In the process of mining, plumes will be created at the seafloor from the vehicle moving around. Plumes will be generated also from the return water. And also there will be other impacts like noise and light that will affect the environment and need to be considered in any environmental impact assessment. Now, the technology exists to do it on to mine all of these mineral resources at some level, but not necessarily at a sustainable industrial level yet. The technology development is going on quickly. Japan in 2017 did the first test mining of massive sulfides, and they lifted the ore from 1,600 meters up to a surface vessel. So they demonstrated that they can do this. And just to give you an idea of the scale of these things, these are the mining heads that have been developed by Nautilus Minerals for mining off Papua New Guinea. This is a human figure for scale. So these are big, gigantic grinders that are going to grind up the ore, put them in piles, and then they get sucked up to a surface vessel. And Japan used grinders like this also. Not these, but similar ones. Now, so it is going to be a mining operation. There's no doubt about that. Let's think a little bit about the habitats where this mining will occur so we can get some understanding of what the environmental impacts are and what we need to do to manage the mining so as to minimize the impacts. And so we'll talk a little bit about, CCZ stands for Clipperton Clarion Zone. And that's this area here between the Clarion fracture zone and the Clipperton fracture zone. So that's this area here. You're welcome. Let's talk a little bit about the physical characteristics of the Clipperton Clarion zone. Now, most people, when they think about the abyssal seafloor, they think it's just a vast flat plain of sediment just going on for thousands and thousands of kilometers. But in fact, it has a lot of topographic heterogeneity. The abyssal plain itself is not just a flat plain. It's, as you can see here, it has undulating bathymetry with troughs and ridges that vary in height by several hundred meters, 300 or 400 meters. And then, so these are three areas actually shown here, 30 by 30 kilometer areas in the eastern end of the Clipperton-Clarion zone. Two of them have this undulating ridge and trough topography, but then a third one, only 100 kilometers away, has lots of seamounts punctuating the abyssal seafloor. Seamounts are a very different habitat. They have a different fauna, very different physical conditions. So the abyssal plain, or this whole abyssal region, has a lot of seamounts, many hundreds of seamounts, and also an undulating topography. It's not just a flat plain. Now, even if we focus on just the abyssal seafloor itself, we can see that it's really has a lot of habitat heterogeneity on all kinds of scales. Now, I think some of the common view of abyssal habitats being just homogeneous came from some early studies where you could go from at one end of the Clipperton-Clarion zone, take a bottom photograph or a sample, and go to the other end and take one, and things could look very similar, just a bunch of manganese nodules on top of mud. But that's a little bit deceptive, because if you go to one area and study it in more detail, within a few 1 to 10 kilometers, you can find areas with no nodules at all, areas that are almost completely paved with nodules, small nodules, areas with larger nodules, high abundance but not as much cover. And then even in these nodule areas, there can be mounds formed by animals and biological activity causing habitat heterogeneity. So in terms of the physical characteristics, there's a lot of heterogeneity across this region on all spatial scales. And this is a habitat itself, so it actually ends up driving heterogeneity in the communities of animals that live here. If we think about the vertical habitat, what happens when you come to the seafloor, the sediment water interface, and move down into the sediment column? There's also vertical heterogeneity. Most areas of the CCZ have what's called a semi-liquid layer, or a very soft mud on the surface down to about 10 centimeters, this light brown area here, and then the sediment becomes more consolidated.
What makes the nodules so important?
They're rich in metals. Metal, yeah. And most of the animals live in this soft sediment here, the very soft soupy sediment at the surface, and this will also be removed by mining, picked up with the nodules during mining. So the bottom line is that the mineral resources and the physical habitats in this region are heterogeneous on scales of meters to many kilometers, and include large variations in nodule cover topography like seamounts, even the kinds of sediments that you see, which vary a lot between seamounts and the seafloor, which is an important aspect of the habitat structure. Okay, let's talk a little bit about ecological characteristics of the abyssal seafloor in the CCZ, or Clipperton-Clarion zone. Again, it's largely rolling plains of fine sediment punctuated by seamounts. It's low in temperature. It's very cold, about 1.5 degrees centigrade, so not too far above freezing. It's physically very stable. It turns out that these habitats are probably the most stable on the planet. Flow velocities are very weak. The bottom waters are clear, as we'll see. And much of the habitat structure in these areas are biogenic. They're formed by organisms, formed by things like giant one-celled animals called xenophyophores. These are like they're like amoebae, giant amoebae that collect sediments and make a house that they live in, and they provide a lot of the habitat structure. They can be 10 or 20 centimeters across, a one-celled animal, or things like sea urchins burrowing through also lead tracks and trails. So the animals create a lot of the habitat structure, and that's fragile. And then the nodules themselves, as we see, provide a distinct habitat on the seafloor. And remember, these are targeted for removal by mining. Another thing to keep in mind is that the bottom waters in the Clipperton-Clarion zone are among the clearest on the planet. This is a map of suspended particle concentrations for measurements throughout the deep sea over the last 40 years, and this is a log scale. So down here is very, very clear water. Clearer water than anywhere in the surface ocean, clearer than when you go out on your boat 20 miles off Oahu. The water down on the seafloor is much clearer than that. And what you can see is that the Clipperton Clarion Zone has all this purple water. It's extremely clear. Visibility is many hundreds of feet if you have enough light. So they're very clear bottom waters, and that turns out to be relevant if mining creates sediment plumes, puts sediments up into the water column. It's going to change the clarity of these bottom waters, obviously. Okay, it also turns out that these seafloor habitats in the Clipperton Clarion Zone are also very food poor. There's very little food available for the organisms living there. And that's because all the food that there comes from the surface ocean. It's fixed in what we call the photic zone, where phytoplankton are growing. And then it sinks out very slowly down to the abyssal seafloor. And this organic matter, or what we call particulate organic carbon, or POC, sinks down, and as it's sinking, it gets consumed by animals in the water column. It gets degraded by, it gets mineralized. So only about 1% of the primary production that occurs in the surface ocean actually makes it down to these deep abyssal habitats at 5,000 years, food poor environment. And we can see how food poor it is if we look at this map. This is a map of the amount of organic carbon or food that's sinking to the seafloor all over the world ocean. And you can see the zone is in the kind of darker blue. It's in this area. So it has an order of magnitude less food sinking down to it than a lot of the more coastal regions, or even 2 orders of magnitude than continental shelf habitat. So there's very little food available. This is a very food poor environment. And so the abundance of animals, the biomass, the community structure, how much biomass is produced, growth rates of animals, recolonization rates, as we'll see, are all very slow because this is among the most food poor environments on the planet. Whoops. Okay. And partly because of this extremely limited food availability, a lot of the animals are very small. These are some pictures of typical animals that you might see down there. A polychaete worm that's a couple millimeters long. And it has tentacles that it puts out on the surface of the sediment and picks up feeds on a very thin veneer of organic material that's sunk down. So it's what we call a surface deposit feeder. So it's picking up, again, very thin veneer of organic matter to get its food. And this food is just available right at the sediment-water interface. There are also some animals we call subsurface deposit feeders that feed down below the sediment, but they subduct surface sediments down through this feeding funnel that they create. But the bottom line is most of the animals living on the sediments in this region are feeding on a very thin veneer of labile organic material, nutritional organic material that's maybe only a millimeter or less thick on the seafloor. But there are also some large animals, what I like to call charismatic megafauna. And these include, some people think that elephants are charismatic megafauna. I think that giant sea cucumbers are charismatic. And these are some examples like this. We call this the gummy squirrel because it looks like a gummy worm, but a gummy squirrel with a long tail. And it's about up to 60 or 70 centimeters long, and they just move along the seafloor and pick up sediments. This is the hind end here. That's the front end. And you can actually see where it's cleared some of the sediments off the nodules as it moves. There are also a variety of different kinds of holothurians or sea cucumbers, very interesting types. There are a lot of sponges, glass sponges that live on stalks and filter water, particles from the water column, Bryzingid starfish, and also lots of different kinds of corals. And all of these animals are feeding either on a very thin veneer of organic material on the surface of the sediment or on a very dilute horizontal flux of particles in the water column. You can see the water is very clear, so there's the animals that are filter feeders or suspension feeders are feeding on a very dilute water particle mix. There are not very many food particles in the water column, and but somehow they're able to make a living by feeding on this very dilute food source of very few particles drifting slowly in the water column. Now, the nodule habitat also is fragile. The nodules are easily broken up. And it harbors a distinct and abundant obligate fauna. It turns out there are lots of animals that live on the nodules, these like these xenophyophores, corals, rising starfish, anemones, and they don't live on the surrounding sediments. And even some of these are very interesting. Like this is actually looks like an anemone, but it's a new order of Selanorate or Cnidarian with tentacles that are 3 meters long. These have only been seen once before and far away several thousand kilometers away on a mid-ocean ridge. So there again, there's a characteristic fauna of the nodules that only occurs, it's an obligate nodule fauna. It only occurs on the nodules. If you take them away or bury them, then this fauna will go away.
And what was the one in the bottom right?
The one in the bottom right.
It's not been seen, no.
Oh, it's anemone-like. It's a new order. It's Relicanthus as the name, and it's currently being described. But one of the things that characteristic of all these animals, I'll point this out again later, is most of them are new to science. 70% of the animals or more that we bring up from these studies are new to science. They haven't been described. So every sample we take, we are potentially discovering new species. But there are not enough taxonomists in the world to keep up with describing these new species. People that, scientists that describe a new species.
I have a question. How deep is this, I think it is photos from?
They're all from between 4,000 and 5,200 meters deep.
And how are they taken?
We go down with remotely operated vehicles so robotic vehicles or with submarines and take pictures and things. And we also we drop cameras down remotely that sit on the seafloor and take pictures for hours or days, and then we call them up again. We tell them to drop a weight and they come back to the surface. Okay, now I'm a scientist, so I'm going to show you some data, but because this is how we learn to understand things. But it turns out that all of the best studied communities in this area that's targeted for nodule mining have really tremendous biodiversity, remarkably high biodiversity. Now, we've studied one area in detail. It's a 30 by 30 kilometer area here in the eastern end of the Clipperton-Clarion zone. So it's like the size of eastern Oahu. It's quite a small little area. And in this area, we took 12 box scores. A box score is it's an instrument that we lowered at the seafloor. It brings up a chunk of mud that's half a meter on a side. And then we sorted all the animals, the macrofauna, the animals that we could see that are large enough to see with the naked eye. Whoops. Although we sorted these with under a microscope. And in those 12 box scores, about 3 square meters of seafloor, we got 880 animals belonging to 227 different species. 70%, more than 70% of them which are new to science. They're not described. And this is just in a 3 square meter area. And when we look, this is the number of box scores versus the number of species that we collected, and this is what we actually observed. And you can see for every box score we collected, we get lots of new species. So we're continuing, even though we have 227 species, we're continuing to accumulate them. This curve is still going up. And if we use some statistical methods to estimate how many species of macrofauna are likely to be in this 30 by 30 kilometer area, it's about 350 species. So we've still, even though we've collected 227 species, we're still only a little more than halfway to collecting the whole community, just in this one little area. Now, it turns out that the macrofauna in the Clipperton-Clarion zone is remarkably diverse. It's really an amazing diversity. One way to think about it is how many species of animals are in 1 square meter, a 3 by 3 area on the seafloor. And we get typically more than 100 species living in one little area. And if you compare the number of species, we're getting the species diversity. We get in this region to other areas. One way to do this is look at the number of species that we collect for the number of individuals. And in the Clipperton-Clarion zone, this green curve here, in 400 individuals, we get about 110 species. And these are curves for all the other areas in the ocean that were sampled with similar techniques that we know of in the deep sea and even in some at shelf depths. And you can see that this area targeted for mining actually has the highest diversity of any place studied in the ocean, which is quite unexpected. This is not what we expected to see. Excuse me, expected to see, but it is a very diverse region. And these high levels of biodiversity go through all size classes, from bacteria up to the biggest animals. For example, in our studies, we've collected about 113 different species. We call them molecular operational taxonomic units. This is that we do DNA barcoding to count species, and we get about 113 prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea. This is from the surface of this area, surface of the ocean, all the way down to the sediments. We've sampled all the way through, get 113,000 species. 97,000 of them are only in the sediments and the nodules, not in the wetter column. So there's much more microbial diversity in the sediments than in the overlying ocean, which has surprised some of our microbiologist colleagues. If we look at xenophyophores, these are these giant agglutinating forams, big amoeba-like animals, blobs. I don't know how many of you remember the movie The Blob from the 60s. That's kind of what these animals are. They just take up whatever organic material sticks to them they encounter. And we've collected 39 species from the Clipperton Clarion Zone. 36 of them are new to science, and this actually represents 30% of the total known global diversity of these animals. So, which is really quite amazing. For all the benthic fauna, using DNA studies, we've identified about 600 species just again in this 30 by 30 kilometer area. And then also the mobile scavenging fauna. If you like to fish, there are lots of fish down there in the bottom. We get a higher species richness of fish in this one area, 30 by 30 kilometer area that we study, that have been found at similar depths off Hawaii or in the California margin. So for some reason, this area has really high diversity of all kinds of organisms, from bacteria up to fish. And this large invertebrate megafauna, not just the fish, is surprisingly diverse. One thing we did is we went to this 30 by 30 kilometer region, and we went out with an ROV and remotely our robotic vehicle, where we drive along the seafloor and take images, take video. And we identified 200 species in a few square kilometers that we studied, that we surveyed. And 100 of these, 50%, were obligate to manganese nodules. They only occur on the nodules themselves. So again, they require the nodule habitat. And most of this turns out to be the most species-rich area ever studied at the abyssal seafloor. No one has seen this many species anywhere at Fortis in the ocean. And to put it in a Hawaiian context, we actually did a similar study with the Hawaiian submersible slopes of the Hawaiian archipelago, where we studied sites that spread along 1,500 kilometers along the Hawaiian archipelago at depths of 350 to 1,500 meters. And we got about the same number of species, about 190 species. So even compared to the Hawaiian slope, it seems to be really diverse. That's not what we expected. It really is quite remarkable. So the Clipperton Clarion Zone, this is 5,000 meters deep, targeted for mining, has surprisingly high biodiversity, much more than 1,000 species of all different classes of organisms, with a single 30 by 30 kilometer area. And most of them are new to science. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about nodule mining impacts. We have a pretty good idea of what nodule mining impacts will be on some scales, although there still are a lot unknown. But one thing we know is that there will be the mining head will move along the seafloor. It's probably be 10 meters wide or so, 30 feet wide, and it's going to suck up or dig up the sediment, the nodules in the sediments, and it'll so remove nodules and sediments to a depth of about 5 centimeters in swaths on the order of 5 or 10 meters wide. Of course, remove the nodules and the sediment habitat systems that are fauna that live on the nodules and in the sediment. And it's also going to alter the sediment geochemistry, which turns out to be important for all kinds of processes, biological and chemical processes at the seafloor. How big a footprint will a single mining operation have? How big an area will it be mining? In order to be economically viable, all the different contractors project that they'll directly mine about 300 to 600 square kilometers per year. A mining operation will last at least 20 years, so they're likely to impact directly about 10,000 square kilometers, which, interestingly enough, is about 1,000 times larger than the impact of a terrestrial mine for these similar kinds of resources, just because the minerals on the deep sea floor, nodules, are distributed over broad areas. There will also be sediment plume effects, indirect effects. So the nodule mining head will move along the seafloor, and in the process, it'll resuspend sediments. It'll cause a sediment plume. And also there will be some kind of tunneling discharge, which may be well. Now, these plumes will bury the nodule habitat as it resediments. It'll bury nodules and turn them into sediment rather than a hard substrate. It'll bury benthos or entomb benthos. It'll dilute the food for deposit feeders, that thin veneer of organic matter on the surface, buried under sediments that have come from the sediment column and don't have any nutritional value. And it will also clog the filter feeding apparatus and gills of the animals that live down there. And also, it turns out that in the water column, most of the animals that live in the deep sea use light, either for feeding and or reproduction. So these sediment plumes will also interfere with light ecology and using it to communicate with mates or to attract prey. Now, a single mining operation from the sediment plume could affect as much as 50,000 square 20 years. So an area nearly the size of 20 years. A single mining operation is expected to go on for 20 to 30 years. So it could be impacting an area nearly the size of a country in Europe like Austria or the Czech Republic, or I think Massachusetts is something like the same size, the state of Massachusetts. Okay, now I've been saying that there will be sediments created by, that's a little bit controversial. Some of the mining engineers say, no, we won't create mining plumes, sediment plumes. We'll engineer them away. We'll put cowling over the mining head or something to prevent sediment from being. But if you work in the Clipperton Clarion zone, you realize that that's just not feasible. And turns out the sediments in this area are very soft. They're very easily resuspended. Normally, they're not resuspended. The water is really clear, but if there's a little bit of turbulent energy put into the water column or imposed on the seafloor, causes major resuspension. So engineering with sediment plumes will be a little bit like putting a genie back in a bottle. And let me show you why. Now what I'm going to show you is video from a remotely operated vehicle that's about 1.5 meters wide, where we do environmental studies in the Clipperton Clarion zone. And the first thing we're going to do is just drop a 2 kilogram weight. We're going to take this weight out of the this is the remotely operated vehicle. It's sitting on the seafloor. We're going to drop that to the seafloor. And you see, just dropping this little weight on the floor causes this cloud of sediment, it resuspends. Okay, it lasts for minutes to hours, this little cloud of sediment. It drifts a little bit in the water, but it takes a long time to disperse. Now we're going to move this ROV a little bit. We're going to move it forward a little bit, just push down with thrusters to lift it slightly off the bottom. We'll move very, very slowly at like 1/10 of a knot. And watch what happens. We're trying not to resuspend the sediments. We're doing everything we can to keep from creating a sediment plume because that interferes with our ability to work. But being as gentle as we can, this is what happens. And the vehicle trying to move 0.5 meter, creating a giant sediment plume. Now, that the mining heads themselves will be 10 to 20 times bigger than these. They're going to be moving at 1 to 2 knots, not at 1/10 of a knot, because they've got to cover that much area to pick up nodules, and they're going to be blasting most of the plan for most of them is that they'll blast water in front of them to pick up the nodules, and the nodules will be sucked up into some bin. Some wastewater will be shot out the back of this device, and then it'll move on. And this is an example of how some of the mining contractors show their technology. It looks like it's moving along the seafloor, picking up nodules, leaving a clear path with no sediment plume. But in fact, it will create a huge sediment plume. And when you recognize that this will go on for 24/7, this plume is going to be pretty big, I think, and a lot of the people that model them.
What energy system is being used to drive that thing?
This one has that. Well, electrical, and there'll be electrical energy coming down the tether to this, and then it depends. Electrical energy transmitted down a cable, and then there'll be a lot of hydraulics. Most of the moving parts will be driven by hydraulic.
Question.
Guys, we'll get to those at the end, yeah?
Well, if you have a quick one, real.
The nodule pictures that you go to, like they were, and they'll be scooped up. How come they don't go down deep?
The nodules, for reasons not completely understood, remain. Most of them are at the sediment-water interface, and they're denser than the sediment, but they stay up there, and there are a variety of theories with it. It's not clear. Most of them are at the surface or near the surface. Now, why do we think these plumes will affect large areas? If the nodules weren't just giant patches that were hundreds of kilometers across, then the edge area would be small, the total area inside to be mined, but occur in giant patches. Because of this ridge and trough topography of this area, the nodules follow this ridge and trough topography. They tend to be on the slopes or the tops of the ridges and not in the trough. This is a map. It's 20 kilometers by 40 kilometers of the French claim area, and these are what they call mining blocks. These are dark areas or areas where there are rich nodules. In between, and the nodule-rich blocks are about 2 or 3 kilometers long and 10 kilometers, 2 or 3 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers long. But interspersed between them are areas that are 5 to 10 kilometers wide, or less than 10 kilometers, that are nodule poor, nodule free. And so they're going to mine these and not mine, they won't operate in these blank areas, the white areas. But it turns out the plumes are almost certainly going to affect these areas even between the directly mined areas and these nodule poor areas. And this is an example of a modeling study of a mining operation for 10 days in an area. This is an area here about the size of this circle. And this is just a model of the plume that's dispersing. And areas that are blue, all these blue areas have burial rates or turbidity rates that are 1,000 times the background level that the animals, organisms are adapted to deal with. And so 10 kilometers away at least, you're getting, just in 10 days of mining, not a year or 20 years of mining, you're getting massive, much higher concentrations and burial rates than you get in the background community. So if you put this little mining operation in one of these strips here, that plume is going to spread at least 10 kilometers. So the whole area is going to be bathed by nodules. So even though only about 20% of this square here or rectangle is actually mineable nodules, 100% of it will be bathed in the mining plume. So that's why we think in reality that on the order of 5 times or more of the area directly mined will be indirectly impacted by the nodule plumes. Now, it also turns out that these benthic ecosystems in the Clipperton clearing zone are among the least resilient on the planet. And you might ask, well, how long will they take to recover from mining? We can get some insights from this track here, which was created by test mining. A test mining head was dragged through here. And you can see it looks really fresh. There are clumps of sediment here, etc. Now, if you it's about 1.5 meters wide and 10 centimeters deep. If you came across this in the desert somewhere, like from a car, dune buggy driving through, you would say, well, maybe it's a couple weeks old. Maybe, it's really stable desert environment. Well, this was created 26 years before this picture was taken. So after 26 years, it looks completely fresh. The structure of the ecosystem hasn't even started to recover. When people have sampled the sediment geochemistry and the organisms living in the sediment, myofauna, small organisms, big things like sea cucumbers, etc., after 26 years, it's still very disturbed. So it's pretty clear that the soft sediment community will take many decades to recover. And this is just one little track. If you have, thousands of square kilometers of these things, then, it may take even longer, certainly for the animals to migrate in or to recolonize. So the soft sediment system will take decades, maybe centuries to recover. Now the nodules themselves, remember there's an obligate nodule fauna that only live on nodules, and the nodules grow at a few millimeters per million years. One of these nodules is like 5 to 10 million years old. So when they're removed or buried, they're gone. It's permanent removal. It really is mining. It's not harvesting some renewable resource. So that part of the community is permanently damaged. So it'll take millions of years to recover. So one thing that means is that then the entire management area, all mining claims, all claims that are mined, will be impacted before any recovers. Even if it takes 1,000 years for us to mine all the nodules out there, the nodule biota and none of those claims will have recovered by the time the last area is mined. So what that means is you really need to think about this whole Clipperton clearing zone, manage it as a whole. Consider it being instantaneously impacted by all the mining that will occur. You can't think of it as just, you can mine one part here, that'll recover before you mine another one, because that's just not going to happen. So one thing, what is being done in order to try and mitigate the effects of nodule mining, potential losses to biodiversity and things. So one thing that's really good about it, which is really interesting, is that scientists are already designing marine protection mitigation strategies to protect biodiversity before this extractive activity is beginning. It's the first time in the history of the world that we're trying to set up environmental protection before the activity begins. You look at the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. After that happened, National Geographic published this map of all the pipelines and pipes, 40,000 oil wells, 60,000 miles of pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico, which came to as a shock to deep sea biologists. We had no idea there with this footprint on the Gulf of Mexico. So this all went in before we even had a chance to think about what the impacts would be and how they could be managed effectively. In the Clipperton Clarion Zone, we're trying to be ahead of the game, and we've actually designed a network of marine protected areas, so no mining areas, that are distributed across this whole region. These are these boxes here. And we, with a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation, I worked with a bunch of scientists to come up and design a network of protected areas to protect biodiversity in this region. And we came up with a design that in each of these 9 boxes we needed, these big red boxes, we needed one protected area, 400 by 400 kilometers. And the International Seabed Authority liked our recommendations. They put in this network, except they moved 2 of the boxes from the areas richest in nodules out to the periphery. So in the areas that are likely to be most heavily mined, they actually don't have no mining areas, but we're working on remedying that. But the bottom line is actually there is a lot of work going into how to protect biodiversity in this region, trying to fit it into all the already existing mining claims. And this network of protected areas, it was designed with sound scientific principles. It's up for review again. It was adopted provisionally in 2013. Now the ISA is reviewing it. And we're in the process, since we first designed these, and actually in 2007, a lot of new data have come in the eastern and western end of this region, and we're now reviewing all this data and trying to provide feedback into whether or not we can improve this network of marine protected areas in the Clipperton Clarion Zone. Okay, let me give you some conclusions then. I'm close to the end of my time here. What? 10 minutes, okay. First of all, abyssal Clipperton Clarion Zone ecosystems targeted for mining are physically very stable, and they have very low natural turbidity and sedimentation rates. Seafloor habitat structure is largely biogenic, formed by the organisms themselves or formed by nodules. It's very fragile and extremely vulnerable to direct and indirect effects of mining, like sediment plumes. For example, the nodule habitat can be buried just a few millimeters of sediment, remove it, make it unavailable to the nodule obligate fauna. These communities are food limited. They're very slow growing. Some of the big corals may be hundreds to thousands of years old. They're highly biodiverse, and they'll require many decades to millennia, really millions of years, to recover from mining disturbance for the nodule fauna. Sediment plumes for mining are expected to have major impacts on food acquisition and respiration in abyssal communities, but actually they're still very poorly studied. These ecosystems are so remote, it's very hard to study how sensitive the animals are to these sediment plumes. I don't have this in the conclusions, but one thing that is going on is there is a lot of scientific research going on, and a lot of smart people, present company excluded, that are really thinking about how to manage this system so that we have an adequate set of protected areas to protect biodiversity, and also ways that we can mitigate the effects of mining. One of the things that I'm pushing for is that they only allow one mining operation to occur at a time. They just mine one area, and we study it intensively and see what the effects are for a decade or two before we allow another mining operation to go ahead, because we still don't, it's really difficult to predict what the effects will be of mining 24/7, continuous plumes exposing these communities for years at a time until we actually study them. But one thing I think we can say is that deep sea mining is coming soon, and that society has to weigh the costs and the benefits. There's tremendous riches in the form of these minerals, but there also will be major environmental impacts in the most pristine ecosystems on the planet. So we really need, and very biodiverse ecosystems. So we really need to decide, society needs to decide what level of mining is appropriate to gain, and environmental disturbance is appropriate to gain these resources. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay, I'll move from the front.
Would you put on the screen one of your best global views of the CCZ again?
One of the best.
Global view. So I can see the kind of
Yeah, can you
West Coast and Asia.
here? This is a
I
globe.
wanted, not that detail, I wanted kind of location ones.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Probably this. No. This one. How about this?
No. What's got to be global? I mean, I can't,
Did you see a slide that had this?
what?
Did I have a slide that you want to see, or?
Well, one of the last ones again, maybe try that one
It
again,
was
there was a small
up the
picture.
right.
One of the last ones that you had, the CCZ, and there was a small picture on the left bottom.
Here?
Oh, shoot that one up again. Okay, now.
Here?
The corner, yeah.
Yeah, that's the Clipperton and Clarion zone here. So.
Okay, now, that one's, they got a perfect rectangular horizontal.
Well, isn't? Yeah, that's.
It's not that, it's slanted, right?
Yeah, it is slanted.
Like,
Goes
like this.
like this one here. Yeah.
Okay,
Because these are you can see the fracture zones that bound it.
okay.
So on this same slide here, the 9 boxes that you have, those are not the protected spaces.
Those are no mining areas. Those are the.
That entire thing is no mining.
No, each of these boxes here, like this. Yeah, each of those boxes, these 400 kilometers on a side, and these are the protected areas. And the core zone where we don't think mining sediment plume effects will reach are these central areas here.
How heavy is a nodule?
How heavy is a nodule?
What's it density like? Is it like a stone?
No, they have a lot of porosity in them. So they're heavier, slightly heavier than pumice stone. Well, they have quite a bit of pumice. A lot of pumice floats. So they're quite a bit heavier than pumice because they do sink literally like a rock, but they're not like a solid rock. I mean, the minerals are they're high density, but there's a lot of water space in them.
Maybe that's why they're on the surface.
They're denser than the sediment.
So that's going to require an enormous amount of energy to pull this column up,
Yeah, they're going to have to pump it up.
to get it moving upwards.
Right.
You have to pull in that water,
Correct.
and that's going to pull in some of the sediment.
Well, the volume of what they're going to do is they're going to concentrate the nodules into very, concentrated slurry to go up. You can't get too dense, so they won't be able to lift it. But the amount of water they're transporting up is not very much compared to the volume of the plume created by moving this giant head across the seafloor. But there will be a lot of the dewatering plume will be a significant volume of water coming back down, and quite a bit of sediment as well. So that sediment, even if they suck it up the tube, it's not staying on the ship, it's coming back down. So it'd be a plume one way or another.
Yes, I understand the processing, once they're on the surface, to separate out the atoms of cobalt, manganese, nickel, copper,
Well, they'll take them to shore to smelt them, yeah.
and it's very expensive and it's a very big ring. I described it as like a 2-mile wide ring that's green around one of those plants separating.
Yeah, I mean, smelting is a dirty process, but that's true for land-based ores as well. So really, I mean, one way is to reduce the demand for these things, but it doesn't for these materials. But that doesn't seem to be where the world is headed. Yeah.
Just such an interesting talk with so many ideas to think about. One idea is it must be financially better to go through this expensive mining, deep sea mining, rather than any sort of recycling of manganese and cobalt and nickel and copper. It's
Well-
not as if we're using up, oil or coal.
Well, the thing about recycling is that copper is already about 50% recycled. So if the demand goes up 20-fold, we can't meet that by recycling 50%. And so recycling is, at this point, probably not the answer until the production is ramped up. Some of the mining companies, one of them says that they're only going to do this until they can mine enough of these materials off the seafloor that we can go into a circular metal economy and they can be recycled. There's enough in the system that they can be continually recycled. But we're not there yet, and I don't believe them when they say that. They say, oh, we plan to do that. We'll stop mining in 10 years when it's a circular economy, but their mining permit, they're requesting a 50-year permit. So it doesn't seem like they're going to stop mining in 10 years. And they're a profit-making company. They're not a... So.
Can I ask another question real quick?
Yeah, well, let's see. There's one here, and then...
Yeah, and then a little bit last year.
When they're mining, do they know that they're killing marine life?
Yeah, they know they will. And it's a trade-off. It turns out that a lot of human activities, like mining, like fishing, kills marine life or terrestrial life. And so we have to decide whether that's acceptable or not. It's too bad, but they know. But to be honest, a lot of the mining contractors don't like to hear what I'm telling them about these ecosystems because it's unfortunate that they're really cool animals down there. And I don't want them all to be killed. That's for sure. So that was a good question. There and then here. Okay.
Okay, that one more over here. Towards the beginning of your presentation, you did show us that map with the 3 different colored dots indicating the different types of harvesting that's going to go on. And I'm assuming that because there were no or almost no dots in the Arctic and Antarctic area, that it's because we haven't prospected there. Or is for some reason they're very little.
Yeah, these are known deposits or suspected deposits. And yeah, there are some, and there's a little one in the Antarctic here. Some of these polymetallic sulfides, massive sulfides, are thought to be there. But a lot of that, yeah, is because of, you're right, lack of prospecting.
There's probably a lot up there. And it's-
Well, maybe.
Melts will
Yeah,
be digging that up too.
maybe. Yeah, in the Arctic Ocean in particular. We had one.
When companies get going on this, first of all, do they have any limit on how many claims they can make?
Well, that's a good question, because everybody thought that for a long time that it was just one, but then Lockheed Martin, through UK, their subsidiary UK Seabed Resources, filed a second claim, and they got a second one. And there are no rules against them filing, I guess, at least two, and there may be more that individual contracting entities may file.
Okay, and then if they violate the laws that are set up to stay in a certain area so that the plume isn't too wide, and they violate that, are there any teeth in that law?
Well, in principle, there will be, or there should be. The ISA is now generating the exploitation regulations. They have regulations of exploration, what you can and can't do to explore the nodules, which is generally relatively environmentally benign, but the mining itself will be very potentially destructive. And they're trying to set up all kinds of regulations, monitoring criteria, what happens if the regulations aren't being followed. They're supposed to be, the ISA can tell them they have to shut down their operation until they can show they're not causing serious environmental harm. But one of the big challenges will be actually monitoring things. It's such a remote environment, and you have to be monitoring almost continuously. You don't necessarily know where the plume is going. It's going to be a big challenge to monitor it. And costly. But the other thing is, each mining operation will probably cost $3 to $4 billion just to get up and running. So a few $100 million of environmental monitoring isn't very much, maybe.